I'm hoping that you can all see that okay. And I will just go through a few things. I think some of what I talk about should be very familiar to you, and I'm hoping that some of it will also be new. So, my background, my current work, there's already been a pretty good outline here, but I have a lot of experience at working in private practice, relationship counselling, chronic terminal illnesses, palliative care, bereavement, including through suicide. I was originally addictions counselling, and that obviously had with it a lot of pressures, including suicide, that I learned at a very early age in my career how to manage. I supervise, train as phone and internet-based services, I have managed teams in not-for-profit agencies. I'm not managing any at the moment, and I do a lot of quality auditing as well. And I lecture at 3 different unis and colleges on bachelor's and master's of counselling, psychology and social work courses. So kind of broad-based, and that's actually very important for me because I think I would not be able to continue to work in my therapy career if I was doing that full time. So clearly we need to start with how do we identify clients at risk. And I'm quite sure that most of you will know how to do this, but let's just be complete here. How well do you know the person? Because if you know them, that will impact your decisions. If there's any doubt, always we assume that the person is at risk. These are some of the common areas that might appear in your conversation, whether it's by phone or internet, doesn't matter. They might be feeling hopeless or helpless. They might feel disconnected, very isolated, very alone. Apathy, really just given up. May be very, very angry. And usually, as I'm sure some of you know, we don't think people are at risk if they're angry because they're expressing emotions. So they must be feeling feelings and therefore they're not depressed and so on. But be mindful. Rage, anger, revenge can also be precursors for suicidality. Obviously, if somebody's got an impending court hearing or legal proceedings, they're very vulnerable. If they're acting recklessly, if they're increasing their alcohol or drug use, if they've withdrawn from people around them, if they're reporting that they're anxious or they're agitated or they can't sleep, or alternatively they're sleeping far too much. And obviously if they've got dramatic mood changes, sometimes it can be even to more positive states of mind. And we know that if people are actively suicidal and are planning their suicide, they can often find a sense of peace that they haven't felt for a long time prior to that. If there's no reason for living or sense of purpose, loss of interest, giving things away, and of course, if they're harming themselves. So there's lots of things that you would be looking out for that you can pick up either by phone or internet work. And we're going to talk a bit more about that shortly. So this is the classic idea that if you're talking to somebody who is actively suicidal or who is expressing suicidal thoughts, that you create a safety contract in which the client agrees that they're not going to kill themselves, that they're going to try and you're going to try and help them, or they're going to find some support or some activity to keep them safe. Now, I learned this very early on in my training, but when you're out there on your own in practice, sometimes things are a little bit different. In my early career, I had an experience of a telephone client. I had not got an emergency contact for this person. Learned very quickly about that. I had clearly very poor boundaries because I was pretty new to this whole profession, and I stayed on the phone to this person for 4 hours. At the end of the day, or the end of the night as it was in this case, I realized that I can't stop anyone who wants to actively kill themselves from doing so. And when I was hanging on that phone talking to this woman for 4 hours, it was a really challenging because it was middle of the night. It started at 10 p.m. Why on earth did I pick up my phone at 10 p.m.? Because I wasn't working for a crisis service, another boundary issue. And After 4 hours, I actually said to her, there is no more I can think of to say to you. We've talked around this. We've talked about how you can be safe. You won't give me the contact details for your sister so I can contact her. I can only encourage you to contact her. And at that point, I actually did hang up. The conversation is as clear now as it was all those years ago, which is about 25 years ago now. So a long time ago. And that woman did not kill herself. Certainly not at that time, and for the length of contact that I had with her thereafter. Sometimes it's helpful if you've got a second phone so that you can be making other calls or texts or something on the side. And obviously in a face-to-face session, you might keep the client in your own room while you call for emergency support, but in other modes, you can't physically shut the door on them, but you can try to persuade them to allow you to contact an emergency contact or have someone else come to be with them. If your contract with the client states that you can break confidentiality for such purposes with or without their permission, then of course you must do so. And again, as I learned from that particular night, making sure I have very clear details on my confidentiality contract, making sure that I am very clear about who's an emergency contact. Doesn't matter if the emergency contact is overseas, it's having an emergency contact that's important, with both a phone number, an email contact, whatever, and an address if possible. So once you've sought help and you know that it's on its way, obviously you can continue to talk to the client if they're still engaged, or if they break contact, you then have to go, you've done all you can within your professional boundaries. How do we assess for suicide? There are many, many suicide risk screeners. They're free to download and they're free to use. Some are really complicated, some are very straightforward. Now, again, I want to share something that's happened again with a telephone client working with interpreters. And again, it's when things go wrong, you do your best learning. And in this case, I didn't know that the interpreter was not going to be comfortable with having to ask some fairly direct questions to a client about their risk of suicide, or indeed how their mental health, how they were describing their mental health. The interpreter was clearly distressed and upset by the subject matter that we were talking about. And I only sensed that, again, it was telephone. All three of us were on the phone. I only sensed that because I could hear something in her voice that made me concerned. I did not have trust in that she was translating things appropriately for me, and I did not have trust that the client was really getting the messages or having the questions asked in the way that I wanted them to be asked, so that I could then act appropriately. Depending on the work I'm doing, when I'm working with interpreters, I usually speak to them beforehand now, since that time, and I always say, I don't know where this is going to go. This is a therapy session. I don't know where it's going to go, but it may cover this area and this area and this area, including suicide. Even if I don't anticipate that from a client, I will always include that anyway. Are you comfortable with that? And if they're not, quite frankly, I get another interpreter, even if I have to delay the session. And that can be really awkward. It's only happened to me once. But since I've been explicit with interpreters, I've found they're more willing then to work with me. A screener is not an exact science. It can only be as effective as the client wishes it to be. It's your skills and your expertise that work out a client's risk. The documents can confirm and guide you, but that's all. Now, that's having a screener. There's a very simple thing to do with assessment. And again, from my own practice, I tend to keep things as simple as possible, as clear as possible, as unambiguous as possible. So whether on the phone or video conference, if I sense that a client is at risk, I use very simple words, very clear words, and I ask, do you have a plan to kill yourself? That's not going to be the first thing I say, but it certainly is in there. If they have no intention, they always respond with, no, 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 I don't want to leave my child, my partner, my mother. But they might say they've thought about it. And if they have, then the next questions are important. How are you thinking of killing yourself? When are you planning to kill yourself? Where are you planning to kill yourself? And I find when I use words like kill yourself, it really comes home that I'm taking them seriously. but also that that is what they are talking about doing. So I make simple, quick notes. If I'm on video conference, it's very important that I'm not sort of looking down all the time, that I'm looking as far as I can at the camera, at the client. I think simple is effective. I think it's less overwhelming for an agitated client. I listen to what they say back to me and I hear. And listening and hearing are very different, particularly in phone sessions. I want to just divert to how we should behave as practitioners if we become aware that a client is suicidal or at risk of harm. On the phone, you've got to keep your voice calm, warm, compassionate, and firm. You have to sound like you know what you're doing, because that inspires the client to feel safer and perhaps less vulnerable, perhaps less inclined to act, and if not, certainly more inclined to tell you what their intentions are. On video, be really aware of your movements. Hold the eye contact as best you can. Look at the camera wherever possible. If they look up, they see you looking at them with 100% attention. And for that reason, tell them that you are making notes, but don't look down like this for any length of time, because clearly that disengages you. And I don't know if any of you had this experience, but I'm really good at writing notes while I'm talking. I have a big piece of paper next to me and I just write on that paper. It doesn't have to be beautifully handwritten. It just needs to be there so that I've got a record of certain words and I don't break eye contact, apart from very, very, very minimally. On video conference, from the client's point of view, you might have some idea if their words are matching their body language, and this guides how you act. But by phone, of course, it's much trickier. So how well do you know them? I've mentioned that right at the beginning. If you know them, you know what is their usual voice, tone, pitch, speed of talking. If you don't know them, listen to how they speak. Are their words matching their voice tone? Are their words matching their expression? Are they agitated? Are they flat? Does it change if you change topic? Are they coherent? Are they telling a narrative? Are they leaping about from topic to topic? What kind of words do they use? And are those words consistent? And are they responding to you as you would expect? All really, really important considerations. A lot of what goes wrong is our own fears and beliefs. And when I say goes wrong, I'm talking about where we might feel we haven't done as good a session or as competent a session as we would otherwise hope. So explore your own fears or beliefs about suicide. Be clear about what is your stuff. Be clear about what is not your stuff. Because if your own baggage gets in the way, you will experience countertransference and you will be preoccupied with that instead of serving the client's needs. Or worse, you will project your beliefs onto the client. And this is indicated by clients telling you that they're feeling guilty for mentioning suicide, that they wish to end the session abruptly, or that they disengage from the service completely. Now, I'm not saying that clients saying they feel guilty means you are projecting onto them. I'm saying it's one of the indicators that you might be. So, transference and countertransference in remote modes. I'm aware that this can be a bit controversial because people have done research to the contrary, but I honestly believe from over 25 years of practice in this field that there is no difference in transference and countertransference to face-to-face work if you are skilled at using the different modes and if you are self-aware. How do you detect countertransference and transference face-to-face? Why would it be any difference with video conferencing? The medium will not make such a difference. On the phone, you have to work much harder to have a skilled therapy session. Therapy being the important word here. Anyone can have a conversation, but there's no difference to how you might experience countertransference when you're on the phone. And from clients, transference manifests similarly to face-to-face. So if you have clear boundaries, for example, about your availability, about your role with the client, and if you hear the client's emotions clearly and you challenge inappropriate expression, then you are as aware as you can be of their transference. Practitioners sometimes report that when there's no visual contact, they second guess themselves, particularly if they don't have a well-established relationship with the client. That makes sense. And if you have not received specific training in using the phone or video conference platforms for counselling work, for therapeutic work, practitioners report feeling less comfortable with the modes in order to develop an effective online therapeutic alliance. At the end of my slides, there's some references to research that was done particularly last year during COVID, which supports these statements. A hypervigilant or anxious client will sense your hesitation or discomfort without knowing what exactly they're sensing, and that can lead to a lack of confidence in the practitioner or to the client making incorrect assumptions about their own mental health. So, phone and video conference are equally effective as long as the practitioner is confident in all three modes. That's face-to-face, phone, and video conference, as long as the practitioner is self-aware and self-reflective, as long as the practitioner has had training in all three modes, and that their supervisor has had experience of all three modes. Because if you're supervising somebody who's working by phone and you yourself don't work by phone or have never worked by phone, you cannot be aware of all of the nuances that the practitioner is discussing, or even things to help them reflect on. Often the phone is the least comfortable because practitioners are hampered by the lack of visual cues. If this applies to you, do not use the phone for therapy. That has been the theme of my books and all the writings I've ever done, because honestly, if it doesn't suit you, don't do it. Back in 1993, which is when I was first starting in this field, the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy kicked me out of their association because they decided that at that time telephone counselling could not be considered true counselling because there was no eye contact and physical presence. Thankfully, when internet counselling started a few years later, the phone was kind of sidelined. People weren't so worried about its validity as a mode for counselling. But one of the things that we have to be really aware of now, because we are so much more sophisticated, of course, is privacy. Now, for us working in Australia, end-to-end encryption is enough. Zoom, WhatsApp, Messenger, they all provide end-to-end encryption. WeChat does not use end-to-end encryption. Always check the status of the app you are intending to use for your work with your clients, whether voice only or visual, because you need to know that with regards to your own privacy regulations and what the organization you work for, or if you're in private practice, what your practice requires you with regards to privacy. I'm just going to slowly begin to wrap up with a bit of talk about challenges and opportunities. So, poor connections, phone, internet, poor connections. If the line drops out or the internet drops out, what are you going to do? In your early contracting, your very first contact with a client, you need to tell them right at the beginning, if we lose contact, this is what I will do. What I usually say to them is, if we lose contact, I will send you a text, an SMS, because I found that SMSs tend to get through when voicemails don't, or voice calls don't. And also, if the internet drops out, most people can pick up an SMS. Just says, I will be in touch soon, or text me as soon as your connection is back. Okay. Background noises, what's going on? Is somebody interrupting? Are they safe? What are the potential breaches of confidentiality? Might be obvious, you need to be explicit. Ask whatever you can hear. I've heard a noise, are you okay? Closed question, yes, no, then you can carry on or not. Where are they for the session? I'm sure some of you have done, as I've done, sessions with people who are sitting in their cars. As long as they are alone in their car and are safe in their car, that's a safer place than anywhere else for them at that time, no problem. If there are other people in the car, I am less inclined to take a session. I will rearrange an appointment, but I'm quite concerned that other people might be listening to what's said, and I'm not sure what that's about, and I don't want to be involved in a manipulation or a dynamic that I'm not aware of. Unclear boundaries. Express your boundaries really clearly. hold your boundaries. And if you're working by phone, you really must make sure that these are clear, that they're in writing, that they are sent to the client if possible, if there's time before a session. In an emergency, we just orally tell them and then acknowledge that the client says, yes, I've heard. Okay. Leaving the session, I'll talk about that in a sec because it's really important. If you're leaving a remote session, it's not the same as walking out of a practitioner's office. Always, after my early experience, verify the emergency contact and the way in which you might contact them. How much of an intake assessment you do? Well, sometimes I've had people coaching people in the background on what to say. Again, if it's a crisis, I'm not so worried about all the intake stuff. Let's just get right to the point. What is it we're trying to function here? We're not doing therapy at this moment. We're doing crisis intervention and management. Your interpreter should be in the same mode. So you don't want an interpreter who is on the phone if you're doing video conference. It really helps if you have, as the practitioner, if you can be aware that you're all working from the same mode. What you hear and how you interpret what you hear will be more congruent if you're all in the same mode. If your admin is all electronic, you will all know, I'm sure, about the privacy and client data storage and so on. Let's just come back to leaving the room, and I will be finishing in a few minutes here. So, phone and video counselling, video conference counselling have the disadvantage, of course, that when you finish the connection, the client does not physically leave and travel somewhere else and re-engage with their lives. What do? We have to make sure we leave the room. So if you deem that a client is not at risk as the session ends, it's important to finish the session in an up phase. No long summaries of all of the discussion points. Reinforce goals gently. Gently is the key. Set or reinforce clear boundaries for future contact or for any contact between sessions, whatever it is that you allow. Reiterate the safety plan as the final thing that they leave with. If a client is at risk, we go back to the slide I had much earlier, which was about making sure that you contact an emergency contact or 000, or that you have discussions with them about how they're going to stay safe. Phone and internet work require more directive interventions than face-to-face. So ask direct questions, be prepared to follow up referrals or advocacy as appropriate. No matter what modality you use as a practitioner, when you're working by phone, particularly, you need to also at times be quite directive. That's not directive in terms of advice giving, that's directive in terms of asking more pointed questions than you might otherwise ask. I've alluded to this already, but informed consent is essential before you actually get into the main part of the first session, because you have to avoid challenges for yourself later on. If you haven't had informed consent, it's really messy if you then have to contact emergency services. So it's something to do immediately, if not prior to the actual session, as soon as the session begins. And if you do it orally, so that you are not actually giving a piece of paper for someone to sign, you need to make a very clear note on your records that they have agreed to all the points, that you have been expressly clear about them, and you put the date and the time that the agreement was reached. Really important for your records. Safety plans or contracts that are developed in a phone or internet session have to be provided to the client in writing as soon as the session ends. Are you going to text them? Very long text. Are you going to email them? How are you going to get them to the client? It's important that they have a hard copy, or at least a virtual copy, so that they can refer to it when they need to. And you also need confirmation that they have received it and that they agree with the contracts and plans, a bit like I've just described about oral confirmation, so that you have it on your records, because that's really important for you, for your own professionalism. And also it demonstrates to the client that you're taking this really seriously. And that actually can be reassuring for the client. Contact the emergency contact with the knowledge, even if not the consent of the client. If your client hangs up, disconnects, and you haven't got to this point, but you have the emergency contact information, you have to go ahead. Follow up with the client in whatever way you've agreed in your plan or your contract. What kind of modalities do we work with? Well, quite frankly, if it isn't obvious by now, person-centered. Person-centered focus is the most important because in that way, the client is feeling as important, validated, and valued as we can possibly convey. So unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruence are essential. Allow lots of narrative processing if they wish to talk. If they're silent, sit with the silence. On the phone, I usually wait about 10 seconds maximum, and then I will break a silence and check what's going on. But video conference, if I can see they're reflecting and thinking, I might leave it longer. Don't teach. Although obviously on video you can share your screen with some material if you want. On the phone you have to talk it through in a non-psychoeducation way because it's not a lecture, it's a discussion. The most successful phone sessions are those that seem to the client to be like a chat. They're not a chat for you, you're working really hard, but they come across as a chat and clients feel that they've been heard, listened to and heard. Two very, very, very different things. So whatever other modalities you like to use, don't forget your fundamental person-centered techniques. Sometimes that's all they need. For ourselves, practitioner support, this is a little model that I use a lot called breathers, sustainers, and restorers. And breathers are many small things that can be done daily whenever a stressful event occurs. Quick breath, literally, a focused, mindful, quick something, a scream into a pillow, a short walk. Sustainers are a longer, may require planning, but they're a longer term thing. So you have to have social activities. You might be somebody who likes to garden. You might do a lot of exercise. Maybe you go to the gym. Maybe you write about your feelings. Those will sustain you. And restorers, supervision, absolutely 110,000%. Supervision is key to keep you safe in your profession. Maybe you need to do your own therapy. Maybe you do meditation. You follow spiritual beliefs and rituals, yoga, massage. All of these things help sustain us. And if you're working a lot in the fields, in trauma fields, you will know all of this already. But BSR is a neat little way of remembering. Breathers and sustainers fill our cup from outside because they're external things. The restorers are the great things that fill us from within. Phone and video conference are here to stay. Thanks to COVID, practitioner use of technology has increased far quicker than would otherwise have happened. Not every practitioner is effective in all modes. Do not work in a mode that does not fit with you because you're more likely to misinterpret or overreact to situations. And the phone is the most tricky mode of all. Lack of visuals requires different kinds of listening and different focus from the practitioner. Please, please, please seek training to be effective in phone and video conference because using them for therapeutic purposes is very different from using them for social activities or indeed any other professional activity. I reckon I've been talking for 30 minutes now. There are some references on these slides which you will get to get copies of later. There's many, many more, but I just picked a handful of a range of interesting articles. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I will now stop sharing.